the recording. Perfect. Okay, with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks all for tuning in today. We're fortunate to have Eric Schweikart, who is a staff archaeologist at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation Department of Archaeology today. Eric has worked as an archaeologist in cultural resource management, the university space, and museum settings for over a decade. His research interests are focused on questions of consumerism, identity, household economies, and colonialism in the North Atlantic during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. He holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Tennessee at Knoxville and has excavated at a range of sites across the southeastern US. And today we're excited to hear from Eric on some interesting challenges and the usage of pollen data at Colonial Williamsburg. And so with that, I will hand it over to you, Eric. Thanks for being here.
Of course. I want to thank everybody for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you all. And I will present, obviously, as that's that, but I'm really excited about the Q&A because I'm very interested in getting everybody's information and your guys' take on sort of what we're doing and how we're doing it. All right. Can everyone see the slideshow?
Yep, looks good.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Well, all right. So let's get started. The way I thought about doing this presentation is to talk a little bit about some of the pollen analysis that we have done here at Colonial Williamsburg, but to really go into like the specific types of questions that we have tried to ask with pollen data. Colonial Williamsburg, the organization, has a pretty actually long history. Working with pollen data going back into the 90s, but I've come on much more recently, and sort of based on my experience of the sort of projects that we're doing and the way that we're trying to understand what we're trying to understand about the past by doing archaeology, have been using pollen in a particular way. So I want to really emphasize that, talk about here's what the questions we're asking, here's the sort of way that we're looking at the data as it's coming back, and then really just get your takes. I'm very much interested in pollen. I've gotten really obsessed lately with it, but I'm certainly not a pollen analyst. My specialty is much more in looking at consumerism and commodification and those sorts of things rather than sort of environmental questions about the past. So I'm very, very interested to hear your guys' take on what we're doing and any suggestions that you have for how we can better go about sort of answering your questions. I'm very open to hearing about. So just as a real quick for any of you who may not know, which there's probably plenty of you, Colonial Williamsburg is a outdoor historic museum situated in Williamsburg, Virginia. It was founded almost 100 years ago, 99 years ago now. Next year will be our 100th anniversary, and the goal was to essentially buy up an entire historic town that was the second capital of the Virginia colony when it was a British colony, and restore it to its appearance sometime around the time of the American Revolution, directly before the Revolution, as sort of an educational space. So from the beginning, the idea was restore the appearance of the town to its appearance at some point in that 18th century, and then have people come to the town and be able to experience our exhibits, and sort of the idea being immerse themselves in as much as possible in the 21st century into the 18th century, in order to educate, to tell people the story of America, the United States, Virginia, this particular part of Virginia, and to give them an understanding as best as possible of this is what it would have been like for the people who were here in the 18th century. So that's the goal from the broad spectrum, like up, top down view. Like this is what the goal of Colonial Williamsburg is. And so what we've been doing, what has been happening here for the last 100 years, is essentially a project of restoration. So majority of restoration occurred in the 1930s, 1940s, where they were really digging up foundations, rebuilding structures. This right here is a map from the 18th century made by the French army when they were here in Williamsburg during the Battle of Yorktown, or right after the Battle of Yorktown. They're essentially looking for places to billet soldiers. Williamsburg was right down the road, so they sent a guy. He made a map. He said, "Here's all the buildings in town where we can put the soldiers as the sort of waiting out the winter so that they could go back to France in the spring and summer." So that this has been sort of the goal, is to make at least this portion of Williamsburg, this historic area, look as much like this map, but in real life. And we found all sorts of errors with the map. It's made typical map things. But that's sort of been the goal, is reconstructing and restoring the place so that it can be used as an educational, as a museum exhibit, and as an educational space. So what we do archaeologically, so there's an archaeological department. There has been one since the 1960s. Even before that, there was archaeology happening, but it was more directed by architects. And so since there's been a professional archaeologist and an archaeological department at Colonial Williamsburg, we have been having the roles of essentially working with this restoration. So while the restoration is mostly complete, it's always an ongoing project. There's always a new building, a new site, a new place to restore, to make more accurate to the 18th century. There's lots of property left. Certainly lots of buildings have been restored, but there's plenty more that have not been. And so over the course of the last 30, 40 years, archaeologists at Colonial Williamsburg have essentially been the sort of the first step of the reconstruction. Is we go out, we dig the site, we say, this is what we found about how it looked at a particular time period, and then that's all part of this larger project of then let's rebuild the site, make it look like as the space would have looked at the time period, and then use it as an educational space or a museum site or just a building in the background, that sort of thing. In addition to that, we are on stage, so you can see this photo, which was taken probably 2008-ish. So sorry about the low quality, but I think it really shows this is the sort of life of the CW archaeologist, is looking at portions of buildings, excavating through these archaeological layers, but then also being an exhibit that we're on display to the public. And that's a big part of what's worth funding, with the questions that sort of we get funded to answer, we get money to answer, are questions related to, here's the things that we can do that show that the reconstructions that we make are accurate. I think that's a big part of it, is to say, why would anybody come to Colonial Williamsburg when you can figure out history in a different way? The idea is, well, we can point to, this archaeological thing and say, aha, this window really was here because we found, this piece of window glass or whatever. It's a kind of weird way to do archaeology, but that's the way we do it. So because of that, I guess the point being, because of that, we have a certain set of questions that we tend to ask when we do pollen analysis, and partially a lot of this is driven by, these are the sort of questions that we can justify spending money. The money that we get is often given by donors, and the point of that is usually on our big projects associated with understanding the site better so it can be better reconstructed, so that we can point to things and say, this is how it looked. So number one, one of the most common reasons what we will do archaeology is to say, well, what vegetation was present at the site that is being reconstructed? So the pollen analysis is essentially useful in that way, to sort of say, okay, well, what's happening here in a very, very specific, this particular lot in town, what sort of plants are growing in that area, so that can be reconstructed or in some way reinterpreted when that place is recreated. Another thing that we've done recently a lot is look at pollen analysis associated with either gut contents in burials that we found in town, or privy context. So from the poop, looking at that pollen and trying to understand, okay, what can we say about how people were eating? Because that's a big question that people have all the time that we want to be able to represent. We want to say something to the public about is what were people eating? How were they eating things? What sort of foodways were common for different residents of town, across the time periods. That's a big thing that we have looked into. Another way that we've used pollen is to understand. So from this sort of reconstruction perspective, there's a lot of emphasis put on when were things built and when were things destroyed, because that's going to have a really big effect on what is going to be reconstructed. So if we say this building is present in 1697, then that's the sort of that means, oh, we're going to rebuild it. If it's not, it's not. And so because of that, seasonality of construction is often a thing that we'll use. So we'll look at the sorts of plants that are creating pollen to say, oh, this is being constructed in the fall. Does that fit with any other records that we have of construction projects happening in the fall? What do we know about what is being constructed at that time, and how can we use that to sort of say this is a building that is worth being reconstructed, and to talk generally about the process of building buildings and taking them down. And then the fourth question, and the question that's the broadest and something we talk about, but again is something that typically less. We have to make a stronger argument for why we get the funding for it, is that question of environment and environmental change and the social effects of different, as Europeans show up and as they adopt institutional slavery as the primary means of creating creating wealth and developing their economy in this part of the world. How did that affect the environment in this sort of broader sense? But again, within the process of looking at this particular place, these particular sites. And of course, this is always the hardest one to get at. That's not true. All of these are hard to get to get at, and it's always a bit of a struggle to get to take the pollen data itself and turn it into the answers to these questions. But that's the sort of thing that we tend to get budget to do. So over the course of the last 5 years or so, we've sent out quite a few soil samples for pollen analysis. We've been we've been working with Linda Scott Cummings and Golden to do sort of the analysis of the soil samples. And I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of how we take the samples and why essentially we do them, which ones we have sent off and used. So first of all, we'll often take samples from profile walls, and usually from specific features that are related to some time period that we want to understand. So we tend to take lots of samples, way more than we ever send off, but the ones that seem to get sent off are the ones that are related to, so one of the sites that we've done a lot of work on is a garden site, a formal garden associated with a very wealthy planter in Williamsburg. So we've looked at a lot of planting beds, of root holes, of things related to that garden, and pulled pollen out of those to sort of say what can we understand from that. Obviously the classic profile, the Whirlpack. We've done some column samples, but we usually tend to focus on particular layers or contacts where we think, okay, this is the pollen in here is going to tell us something specific about what's happening in this specific place at this specific time. In addition to that, we try to take some in cases where we run across something that is essentially a good hard thing. So on this side, you can see there's this complete bottle that we found. We're like, oh, that's a great time where we can get something where it's not just soil sitting on top of it, but there's a really hard surface that is impenetrable, that whatever pollen got in there at some point is going to be sort of really well preserved. So we tend to do that in cases of, cases where we find a complete glass bottle or a brick, if nothing else, something placed on the ground. We don't really get much rocks in our part of the world, so we tend to go for bricks. But that sort of idea where you have a particular thing. Another thing sometimes that we have done in the past, though it has seemed to be less useful, has been within mortar itself. So you've got a mortar between bricks and as part of a building. You look at the pollen that sort of was captured within that mortar as it was being made, to sort of try to understand again those questions of the seasonality of construction and demolition and those sorts of things. So these are, classic sort of results that we've been getting. So we've been getting, through the same analysts for the last several years. I think we've ended up with something like 50 samples that we've taken from 4 different sites, looking at the various, types of pollen species, pollen types, genres, families, what have you. And typically those things have been focused on answering questions of, like I've said, specific, like what's happening here, what sort of plants are in this area. So for instance, some of my basic analysis that I feel pretty good about, but let me know. Here's one case. So here's all the pollen samples that we've taken from one of our sites. This is the garden site, early 18th century garden, a wealthy planter. So sort of arranging these are some of the most ubiquitous pollen types, arranging them essentially by time period of the context that is being tested. Time period, again, we're talking about like the difference between early 18th century, mid 18th century, and early 19th century. This is, we're looking at a pretty specific time period, and those dates are based off of the sort of artifacts we're finding, what we know about the person when does he buy the property? When does he start modifying this property? When does he talk about in his letters about having a garden, that sort of thing. And so then you can look for examples. So the thing that I was able to pull out of all this sort of data is to say, oh, look at this. There's a time period where we have these garden features that are just full of grass pollen. Grass pollen is really dominating compared to the sort of Asteraceae. I'm not gonna pronounce that, but yeah, the other types of sort of really ubiquitous non-arboreal pollens. And this I've interpreted as a time period when we have a garden. The garden has a large lawn. Part of that. Grass is a big part of the garden landscape, and then over time, that sort of maintenance that is required to maintain a big open grassy field that doesn't have any other types of plants in it is no longer important to the garden. So therefore, the garden features after that don't have that sort of signature in the same way. The other way, very classic, is to sort of just look at, sort these things by using this sort of time period method, and then just look for, hey, is there any types of, any mentions in, we've got a lot of letters written by this guy about the plants that he's importing from England to plant in his garden, and he's corresponding with all these other naturalists about, I was growing this plant and it did great, and I grew this plant and it was terrible and I don't like it, and you sent me this stuff and it was all rotted and I want real ones, or that sort of thing. So we have all these examples in the 18th century of this guy talking about, here's plants that I want to plant in my garden, or am planting in my garden, or have in my garden and I'm sending to someone else. Which of these match with that, and which context do they come from? So simply just looking at a presence absence scale. Look, we've got some, typically, especially the rose family has been a really good, like, okay, we've got rose family plants. We definitely have lots and lots of discussion of especially stone fruit trees in the garden. We have examples of these sorts of trees being planted in these sort of formal espaliered methods that we found archaeologically from other ways. So this is a way to tie all that sort of information together to really say, yeah, there was a lot of these types of trees around. that could be reconstructed as the garden is reconstructed. It could be regrown in these particular ways. I want to get to questions, but I'm gonna now go on a little bit of a let's go beyond into my weird stats world. Okay, so thing about me, I really like stats. I got into it a lot. So I decided to just start playing with some of this data. I don't know if this all matches up, but this is where I'm going with this, and this is where I'd love input and any sort of suggestions that anyone would have. Um, so taking these 50 or so samples, I did a redundancy analysis, which is essentially similar to a principal component analysis, but we can add different canonical correlation. What variation is associated, which variation in the data set is associated with specific variables. So we can add the variable that we know is in there. So for instance, difference between sites. So that's something I know that these samples were taken from this site, these samples were taken from this site. And I can say, okay, well, what is the amount of variation that we have in the data set that is associated with variation between sites? And then we can condition that out. I can say, let's ignore that. That's not a variable that I'm interested in testing. So I did that in this particular case, because it's all the way the data is. I'm just looking at these very ubiquitous, but very seasonally available types of data, types of pollen. So grass pollen, oak pollen, and then the sort of ragweed, probably pollen. And just said, okay, let's look at this. Let's throw this into this thing and see if we can find cases where we really do have a seasonal. There's just a ton of ragweed pollen in the air when this feature is deposited, when the soil was deposited, that we can maybe look for and say, okay, this may have something to do with season. In this case, I've just sort of conditioned and constrained out all the variation between sites and all the variation that happens over time. Again, the change over time in these particular ones doesn't seem to be very strong, but there's about 9% of the variation in the whole data set. 9.3 is associated with these changes between different sites. But if we condition that out and we just look at the principal component 1 and 2, you can see the sort of the grass type. They each of these different types pull in a different direction. So as principal component 2 is sort of separating the ragweed from the grass and the oak, and then principal component 1 is doing that, and principal component 2 is really separating out the oak and the grass. So you've got things being pulled into these different quadrants. And by looking at that, I can sort of say, okay, well, how about number 44? That's from the demolition of this privy. So we can really say, okay, well, if that's the case, can we say something about seasonality of when this privy was taken down? And that's really important because that can tell. So this privy is associated with a school for free and enslaved Black children. We know when the school started renting this building, and we know when they ended renting this building. And we think that this privy was specifically associated with the students and the people that were using it as a school. So to say, oh, it's happening sometime in the spring when oak pollen is most common, that's really important. I can say, okay, yeah, that supports that interpretation of this privy is associated with the school and these children. 27. So later in the summer, when you get the grass pollen, we found in a glass bottle. So another one of those glass bottles, but this one was specifically placed at the foot of a grave at a historically Black Baptist church here in town, and we were able to do that pollen analysis, and based off of that, so to say, with the seasonality, this grave was probably interred sometime in the summer, which was good because this was actually a reinterment. So the individual had pretty much entirely rotted, had been buried, had pretty much entirely rotted, and then was taken out and then removed to this part of the cemetery. So the upshot of that was the gut contents had nothing in them to suggest like, oh, here's the types of plants that they were eating in the couple weeks before their death, and then therefore it can tell us something about when they died. So this is a way to at least date the reinterment, if not the actual, date of death of that individual. Um, and then this last one, the ragweed, is associated with a boundary ditch. So this was a ditch that was marking a boundary between different places, and filled in with bricks. And so we're thinking that that layer right on top is sort of whatever that pollen signature was of that time period. All right, so that's my stats. That's my crazy stats. Sorry about that. I just had to go into it because I like it. Um, but yeah, so that is where I am. That's my presentation. Um, I'm happy to uh, uh, answer any questions that you guys have.
Thanks so much, Eric. Really
Yeah.
interesting